Welcome to Sherlock Mondays, the Hound of the Baskervilles. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is episode 2, in which we will cover the second serial part of The Hound, chapters 3 and 4, as they were published in the Strand Magazine in September 1901. And joining me as co-host is our good friend, Anastasia Klimchynskaya. Hi, Anastasia.
Hi, it's good to be back.
It is great to have you back. So I mean, really, this is like a continuation of Sherlock, but it's not. It's its own little show. So this is the third show you have been on for us now to go.
I'm so honored.
Well, I love having you. So
I mean, I remember those very first Frankenstein shows, and I was just like, I was so nervous. But now I think I've said this before. Now it's like coming back for a chat with a good friend. So
good, good. So, all righty. Well, everyone, if you have questions during the episode, we will get to them during the show. For the first episode, I tried to do, I figured like we'll do like them in the middle and then at the end. And then it seemed like I could hit them during the show. So I'll answer your questions at some point. But what I would like you to do is put them in the Q&A function of the of the Zoom interface. So if you just put them in the chat, I don't know if our chat assistant might miss it. I can't keep track of questions in the chat. So if you put them in the Q&A function, I will definitely get to them. And if you're in the chat, make sure you're on the everyone setting and not just hosts and panelists, so everyone can see what you're chatting, because the chat is for you. Have fun, talk to each other while we're talking, ask questions of each other. That's totally fine, and answer them and make jokes and do whatever you want to do in the chat. Just be respectful for everybody. And very importantly, no spoilers. Don't put any spoilers in the chat. We're really going to try to stick to just like the audience experienced this serial originally. They only had this serial part, so we don't want to reveal anything that happens later on, especially if something happens here and the revelation of it's something else later on. Don't do that. So no spoilers. And the show is being recorded. I will share the link to the recording with all of you when I send out the link for the episode 3. I'll also share the recording link for you, and those recordings remain available for you to watch until August 31st. All righty. As it is a new show, let me fully introduce our co-host. Dr. Anastasia Klimchynskaya is a scholar of 19th century literature with a deep interest in the intersections between science, technology, literature, and the cultural imagination. She has previously appeared on the Rosenbach's Sundays with Frankenstein, and written widely on Sherlock Holmes, science fiction, the history of science, and the Gothic, and numerous scholarly and Sherlockian publications. She is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, the Old Russian Woman, and helped organize PhilCon, Philadelphia's science fiction convention. Hey, Anastasia.
Hi, it's always so delightful to hear you read one of those because, we write these bios, like months and months ahead of, ago. So it's a nice reminder. What did I write about myself 10 months ago? That's all accurate to still.
And for those who might not know exactly, I wasn't calling Anastasia an old Russian woman. That is her sobriquet for the Baker Street Irregulars. Everyone gets a name when they're inducted.
Yeah, it's always delightful to find out what yours is.
How happy were you when you got yours?
Well, so it's this funny thing because the way they used to do this, and I think that's changed, is they read the sobriquet, then they describe the person, and then they say your name. And so they say the old Russian woman, and then they start, talking. And I'm sitting there looking around, being like, there's another, Eastern European person
really
here.
cool. I gotta meet this person.
Yeah, I mean, it's like full of myself as that sounds. It was kind of like that. I was like, oh, and somebody from the same place I'm from. That's cool. well, all of my friends tell me, as soon as they said that, they knew it was me, whereas I'm here like, who is this? And then they say my name. And then after that, it's all kind of a blur for a little bit.
All righty. Well, I'm happy to have you on this. We were on Sherlock Mondays, and we really enjoyed your contributions to that. Um, Here's a question. I asked Mark and Paul this on the last episode. I don't know if do you remember your first encounter, your first time reading Hound?
Honestly, I don't think I do. I imagine I was, 12 years old or something like we all were. But to be honest, really no. But I was rereading it,
It was
in
just bound
preparation.
up. It was just bound up with your original Sherlock reading then.
Probably, yeah. I mean, I know my original Sherlock reading was the adventures and the memoirs, ending with Reichenbach, but then also at some point the Hound. And I wasn't, thinking about chronology too much. I was like, oh, okay, there's a book set at some point there. Um, but yeah, I wish I had a fun story for you like I did with when we did the stories. And I was like, yeah, I thought they ended with the final problem, but alas.
That's okay because you also have a special connect. I mean, you love this story and also teach it sometimes, right?
I do actually. In fact, if I roll my chair back, I can grab a book to show you because I'm back from Slovenia, so I actually have access to like most of my books. I contributed to this anthology called About 60, which is probably like a decade old now. Time flies. But it's why every Sherlock Holmes story is the best. And I wrote about Hound of the Baskervilles, which um I think is the best Sherlock Holmes story. And I know that's like the most obvious answer, but there we are.
No, no, that's a good
I
one.
can, I mean, I can explain why at length. That's part of what I do, in this book.
Can you do that without giving spoilers?
I honestly I don't recall if I give spoilers, so um I think I probably do because this is sort of intended for a Sherlockian audience, which means we've already all read the stories. So yeah, if you want to avoid spoilers, maybe don't read it until you're done with the story.
Mhm.
In fact, actually, yeah, the argument kind of rests on there being spoilers. So yeah, maybe don't read it until like July, but
There you go. Well, because there are people reading it for the first time, watching this, which I think is,
that's delightful. I was gonna ask, because Hound of the Baskervilles, it's one of those books where you're like, has anybody not read it at the age of 12? But it's so delightful that
yeah.
people are still discovering it.
Well, they are, and I'm so happy we're getting to do this show. Let's just jump right into it. Part one, chapters 1 and 2, ended with the great line, "Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound," which is one of the great, chapter serial endings for any kind of story. Anything that has to be paused and then wait till to continue. It's such a great line, and that's the end of Mortimer telling his story to Holmes. He read the curse, and then he told all about how Sir Charles was found dead, and that's the most arresting thing. What he didn't share with the at the coroner's inquest was that there were footprints of a gigantic hound. Now, people sometimes criticize Anastasia. People say, like, you can't tell if it's a hound by the footprints, but clearly he's going by the curse. And it was, he already knows it's a hound in the curse. So he just assumes the giant footprints
Also, I mean,
are it.
it's an artistic liberty. Like, that makes for a really great cliffhanger. Sometimes you gotta throw reality out the window for a really great like zinger.
Yeah. Well, this issue also starts with an illustration, but we're going to wait till that part of the story to look at that illustration. They something that started with, I think, Final Problem, in which they started doing. Well, it happened in the for the Final Problem, they did a big picture before the story, and then on with that story, and now he's doing it with the Hound, and I think it actually continues with this, yeah, it continues with the stories when they're going with the Empty House and On, which come out the following year from when this was published. We have shared the serial as it was originally published on our at the Rosenbach website for the Hound, so you can find it there. And but we'll skip to that illustration and get right to the story. And it's chapter 3, The Problem. And I confess that these words, and at these words, this is the footprints of a gigantic hound. I confess that at these words, a shudder passed through me. There was a thrill in the doctor's voice, which showed that he was himself deeply moved by that which he told us. Holmes leaned forward in his excitement, and his eyes had the hard, dry glitter which shot from them when he was keenly interested. So, Watson shudders, Mortimer is thrilled, and Holmes is excited. This
It's,
is
it's like
1984.
whenever there's like a murder or something and everybody's like, oh, I'm so horrified. And Holmes is like, he's just like, he's so fascinated. He's like a child in a candy store.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's and especially because, well, he loves these little details and that kind of excite him, but it's the he had referred to this Curse of the Baskervilles as a fairy tale. Oh, to this is interesting to a collector of fairy tales, and he's very dismissive. Now he's interesting because this is real data. This is an observed fact in the world. And now he's like, oh, that's something different. Do you mean there's an observed, like a real thing about this giant hound? Now Holmes wants to get involved.
Mhm.
And his answer is what? It's a series of questions. It's just rapid fire questions. You saw this? You said nothing? How was it no one else saw it? There are many sheepdogs on the moor. Like, he's got these just question after question he's grilling Mortimer to find out what's the, what's going on here. Because
And
Holmes,
you can sort of figure out why he's asking all the questions. I mean, it's, as a reader, maybe you wouldn't have thought of the questions, but now that he's asking them, you can kind of go as a reader, oh, I see why he's asking that.
yeah, he wants all the rest of the facts. He wants all the things that he would have asked at the scene, and all the things that he would have tried to observe at the scene. Um, and Mortimer, and this is, for anybody that when you finish a story, when you go back and reread it, because it's easy to reread, it's great to reread these kinds of things, and then you can really see Holmes and the way he's questions he's asking, and how that bears out on the investigation. But most importantly, he asked about did anyone else examine them? And then he says the marks by the wicket gate, and then Mortimer says Sir Charles had evidently stood there for 5 or 10 minutes. Well, how do you know that? Because the ash had twice dropped from his cigar. Excellent. This is a colleague, Watson, after our own heart. That's exactly the thing that Sherlock would have noticed, right?
Yeah. And it's so nice to have somebody bringing a case to Holmes who like is not incompetent and, notice something like cigar ash instead of being like, oh no, I trampled all over the footprints.
Yeah.
Which is what he usually gets.
Because he's odd too, Mortimer, in that he's odd. I think he's suspicious in his oddness, and yet
he's a scientist also,
yeah,
just like Sherlock Holmes, as we've established here.
yeah,
He's a scientific figure, and that's why Mortimer and Holmes like have this connection. And Mortimer looks at Holmes and goes, I covet your skull, which is just like such a delightful come on line. Like
yeah.
I adore it.
A come on line. Hey. I
They're
don't know if
people
anybody
who,
wants to use that as a come on line, but hey, go for it and let me know
I
if
mean, in a certain kind of context and group of people, maybe. I don't know. I just think it's delightful as just like a compliment to pay somebody to be like, I want your skull.
yeah.
Um,
And
so yeah, they're similar kinds of people. They're scientific men who connect over that fact.
And Holmes loves this. This is precisely the kind of deduction he would made. And he's, this is every now and then he gets a client like this who, who has done the work that he would have done at the scene of the crime. And he always comments about it when that happens.
Mhm.
But of course, if only I had been there. It is evidently a case of extraordinary interest and one which presented immense opportunities to the scientific expert. And then he even says to Mortimer, to think you should not have called me in. You have indeed much to answer for. So, even though Mortimer has noticed this thing about it, Holmes knows that, like, oh, I could have solved this there. He would have solved it just
Yeah,
looking at
and
the
then we
body
wouldn't have one of the best Sherlock Holmes stories that we have. So there.
Very true. So we are happy that Mortimer didn't share it.
I
Didn't
mean, sorry to everybody else who gets to suffer because of this, but we get a great story.
he didn't send a telegram right from Devonshire saying, "You must come quickly." um, Mortimer
Alas.
thinks the case is supernatural, and this now might be a not supernatural because there's physical evidence. He says, Mortimer says this is a realm in which the most acute and most experienced of detectives is helpless. That's why he didn't say anything. That's why he didn't think of calling on Holmes immediately for months until Sir Henry was coming. And Holmes says, "You mean it's supernatural?" And he kind of I didn't say exact. I didn't positively say so, but then he also gives other evidence as such that it is, and that several people, have seen the creature upon the moor, and it could not possibly be any animal known to science. And then he gives the description.
Well, there's a lot that science didn't know at the end of the 19th
Yeah,
century, but they don't want to admit that because they like 19th century science really had this idea that like we were just learning everything and mapping everything and classifying, and there was increasingly less and less that we didn't know. It's not the sense that like the more we discover, the more we realize we don't know. It's a sense of like we're just like mapping and charting every inch of the natural world. Um, so I guess that makes sense. Like in 1901, it's something, or 1900, it's not something yet. No, not something known to science as well. I guess it's got to be supernatural. Whereas to us, where we in the modern day might sort of be like, well, there's a lot science doesn't know, like 90% of the
yeah.
universe.
But the evidence here isn't like there's that footprint that he has, and now it's just what people have seen. So this is very much a Bigfoot situation. This is like a cryptid. Like there's this we've seen this footprint, and now people have seen this. And what they say they have seen is it's a huge creature, luminous, ghastly, and spectral. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and actually, only two of those descriptors are actually factual. The other two are figurative, and it's that it's huge and luminous, meaning it kind of glows. The ghastly and spectral, that's just figurative language. That is then making the jump from if it's so huge and luminous, it must be, and it's ghastly because it's scary, and it must be spectral, supernatural in a sense. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they
Yeah.
um so Holmes, and this is what and he says it exactly corresponds to the hellhound of the legend. And then Holmes is like, you're a
Well,
tra
that's convenient.
you're a trained man of science, and you think it's supernatural. So and this is the challenge here. There's a question from Adam that I'll hit right now. Is it possible that when Holmes and Mortimer are discussing the supernatural versus the rational, that ACD is discussing uh, that
We're trying to
ACD
work.
is in any way investigating his own beliefs? Did he ever express doubts himself about the supernatural, seances, fairies, those kinds of beliefs? Um,
I mean, I think he's absolutely trying to like via writing work out what his own stance on the matter is, because I don't think you can write this kind of story without sort of doing some soul searching about your own beliefs in regards to, the supernatural.
And he has them, and that's the key. Like, we know he has these supernatural beliefs, Doyle, because he has this whole spiritual quest that he's been on for really his whole most of his adult life, but he really becomes a public figure for it, later after this story is when he becomes the public figure for it, although he's already involved now in supporting magazines and supporting the spiritualist cause. The it's what we'll see as we go on here is that, for my answer for that question, is that Doyle, in his spiritualist beliefs, is firmly in the camp of a scientist trying to find evidence for spiritualism. And
Mm-hmm.
that's his whole mission. And so this story, in a sense, it's not like it's kind of it doesn't challenge that in a way, in that it kind of reinforces it in a way, in that Mortimer and Holmes are both trying to come up with, factual reasons why this kind of thing could be real, in this discussion. And that's what Doyle is doing in his life.
Yeah. And I just this is the reason that this is one of my favorite Holmes stories, is that Holmes is such a man of science and rationality. I mean, I think we've established that he is the like emblem of modernity and Victorian rationality and whatnot. Being faced with this question of, does the supernatural exist, or can everything supernatural be explained by science and rationality? That's like the big question that the book then addresses. And I won't spoil what the answer is, but the question being posed here for Holmes and for us as readers is, is rationality and science and a knowable world going to win out?
Mm-hmm.
Or are there things in the world that are incomprehensible to us despite all of our science and knowledge and scientific method?
Yeah. I do see somebody has a question in the chat, in that, but it went to host and panelists. Remember to check your settings so it goes to everyone, but maybe you that didn't realize that. But and the question is, though writing this story predated the death of his son by a good bit, would ACD not have dived as deeply into spiritualism if his son had not predeceased him? I mean, I think that's a biographical question that I'm not sure this looking at this novel really helps answer. But Doyle's been on the spiritualist cause since before he wrote Study in Scarlet. So I think that this is a lifelong thing for him. And I think it intensifies
Yeah.
later in life, as it intensified for many people who lost relatives in World War One, as Doyle did. Well, I mean, it's his son. He died of disease afterwards, or he had fever, I think, afterwards. So he doesn't necessarily die in combat, but that doesn't matter. I mean, so many of these soldiers just died. So many people died, and it really affected people. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Claire has
Absolutely.
Claire has an interesting thing here in the thing. She says, I can't help wondering how the story would have changed in its approach to the supernatural if Holmes hadn't been the main character. Because we talked about this last week, Anastasia, that the uh um that when this story was originally conceived, it wasn't going to be a Sherlock story. It was going to be this supernatural Hound story. And then Doyle realizes, I'll add Sherlock, and that'll, number one, make for a better story and make for an investigation that'll be really great, and also making money. So it's going to make a lot
Exactly.
more money with
Yeah, but he's definitely toyed with this motif. Before, there's the story that he wrote called The King of the Foxes, which I annotated and transcribed for an annotated edition put out by a Sherlockian named Ross Davies, where how do I put this? It's like the Legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles, except it's a fox and they're fox hunting.
Yeah.
And it's this like demonic spectral fox, which is really hilarious to me. But it shows that he was thinking about a lot of the same similar plots and collecting similar myths and legends and stories, long before he wrote Hound of the Baskervilles, and he wrote that fox story, and then he, clearly reused some of the ideas, except, now it's a hound instead of a huge and terrifying fox that drives you mad if you start hunting it.
Yeah. But in that story, there's not this kind of rationalist, supernaturalist kind of thing going on. And I think that is the case in his Gothic stories. In Doyle's Gothic supernatural stories, they're Gothic supernatural. This is like crazy stuff happening that you can't explain. And it is true, I think, by adding Sherlock, then it becomes something else, and we examine it more than people do in other stories where they're just afraid of these things. Now we get to examine what it could be and why would we be afraid, I think, in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Holmes says now he's got this great line, right? I have hitherto confined my investigations to this world. In a modest way, I have combated evil, but to take on the father of evil himself would perhaps be too ambitious a task. Yeah, you must admit that the footmark is material. I love that line, that that Holmes is still, that's a playful line too. He's like, even though I might be fighting the devil, isn't that fun? It keeps him intrigued.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says to Mortimer, I see you have gone quite over to the supernaturalists. So he doesn't say spiritualist, because that's not what this is. It's not a story about spiritualism. That's something different than demonic monsters.
Yeah.
And we should note that as well, that Holmes does too. And Doyle
Yeah,
does.
they're not, trying to speak with, the deceased
Yeah.
soul of, people you knew. It's something else entirely, something a little more sensational.
Yeah, that's another answer to Adam's question too, and that this is also a story that it doesn't really, for Doyle, he might think this has got nothing to do with spiritualism. This is a monster story, and that's the supernatural thing going on here. So
Yeah.
he's not a uh, he is, although raised Catholic, does not believe in Catholicism, and I imagine might have trouble with the whole, fighting the devil in real, physical form. That would be, like exorcism kind of thing. I think Doyle might have an issue with that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All righty. How can he help him? Then if that's not what he can do, like, I can't fight supernatural beasts, what am I supposed to do? And Mortimer now says, actually, really why I'm coming to you is because we have inquired for the heir and found that he had been farming in Canada. um they
That's such like a delightful and, like harmless activity. It's like, he's not off like hunting, whatever in Africa or something. He's just like he's farming in Canada.
yeah, he's a farmer in Canada. Very, like, almost ordinary in a sense, it sounds to us. But for then, this is still like he's in the colonies. He's in one of the colonies, and it's not the most, hospitable landscape to do even farming. We know that about Canada. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that's where he is.
Oh, there's a delightful comment in the chat. British weather won't be too much of a shock then. He's been in Canada. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be like paradise going to rainy, cold.
Yeah. Shout out to, all the Canadian and, also Minnesota and Sherlockians are probably like laughing at this.
Yeah. Um, and then we get a little bit of a kind of a rundown for the family here. a little roundup, that there was it's Roger Baskerville was the youngest of the three brothers. Sir Charles, who's just died, was the oldest. Roger was the youngest. And the second one in the middle was the father, we don't get a name for, was the father of Henry, who they've found now farming in Canada. Roger, the youngest, was the black sheep of the family. He came of the old masterful Baskerville strain and was the very image, they tell me, of the family picture of old Hugo. He made England too hot to hold him, fled to Central America, and died in 1876 of yellow fever. So we get a little family history, and also the idea that some of the family is still connected to Hugo in a way, or at least this Sir Roger was, who died, because this is all over the Holmes stories now. It's all over Final Problem. It's in this, it's in the next one, this idea of ancestry and family traits coming up.
Like this was like a I'm gonna I'm gonna go down my little
Go
like
down
I mean
that
this is
rabbit hole. Do it.
I mean so Mary and Lauren aren't here to like do their gothic spiel, so I feel like it's my job to do it on their behalf. But I mean like this is a gothic novel, right? And the thing with gothic novels is they were always worried about the past coming back to, bite us in the present to in a way. It's always about, is there something in the past that we have built our present on that might then come back to haunt us? And when the, Gothic novel emerged in the 18th century, there was a lot of questions about, like British history and what did we found the British nation on, and we kind of had a revolution and cut off the head of our king. So can we found a nation on that, etc. In the late 19th century, you kind of get this new strain of Gothic, which kind of tries to, I think, scientific guys, make scientific these concerns about like the past coming back. And it's all these worries about what they would have called like heredity, which is, the idea that some kind of decadence or illness or just some kind of problem in your ancestry would come back and affect you in the present, that it would be passed down, genetically. And their understanding of genetics was, far from ours, but they still had, a basic understanding that some things are passed down genetically, which can include things like, addiction and alcoholism. And so in stories like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is published around this time, the picture of Dorian Gray, where there's this wonderful scene where he's walking down like a portrait gallery of his ancestors and worrying, like, have their sins been passed down to me? Like, am I literally living out the sins of my ancestors? So this was something the Victorians were really worried about. It's also what led to a lot of their like eugenicist views, and that there's, the quote unquote undesirables who come from kind of a problematic family and problematic things have been passed down to them versus the good British stock. And of course, notice how there's so much emphasis in these few chapters on, he's the heir. They have found the heir to the Baskervilles, and the heir to the Baskervilles must come take the seat of his fathers. Like the social configuration and the social institutions and the like governance that entire British society is based on is people inheriting from their fathers, their grandfathers, their ancestors. Like the whole British social structure is based on inheritance. In a way that, for us mostly it isn't today. We tend to elect our officials. So this issue of something bad being passed down was a really big concern if, the way that you arrange your society is literally inheritance. Because, this guy, Henry Baskerville, that we meet in a chapter coming back to the seat of his fathers, he seems to want to be a good landlord, but he might have wanted to be a bad landlord. And inheritance is how you just, how anybody is in charge of anything.
Yeah,
Um,
we talked about this last week too, and especially with Dr. Mortimer and his interest in atavism and how this all bears in mind. And I love how you put that the fact that it's also reflected in the social structure of this society, this kind of inheritance. And now when people hear about, oh, wait, do you mean in, in evolution, we also inherit the, genetic things from the past? And so that's all part of the same thing. But of course, their anxiety, as you know, is this fear that these primitive elements might resurface in the present, in their present. And that's the big fear for them, because that's anti-civilization.
well,
Civilization, progressive thing, and that would be degressive,
exactly. And it's in
regressive.
particular this fear that it might surface in the people at the top of the hierarchy, the
Yeah.
aristocrats, the people who are in charge, the people in the House of Lords, the people owning land and governing things, right? Like
People more likely
Oscar,
to be inbred.
yeah, but also, characters like Oscar Wilde, characters like, Dr. Jekyll and Jekyll and Hyde. He's not a major lord or anything, but he is, a respectable upper middle class doctor. Like he's Dr. Jekyll. So it's all of these anxieties about these very respectable characters who would have been in charge of things in like the next generation are the ones who are living out the sins of their ancestors, and we can't have that. And it should be
Yeah.
noted that you know the Hound of the Baskervilles, it was being serialized, right around the time 1900 when Queen Victoria dies, and then her heir takes over, like takes on the throne. Like the Victorian period very neatly ends in 1900. Um, so you had Queen Victoria on the throne since 1837, and suddenly she's been replaced by an heir. So I can imagine that was also on the minds of British people. Like, can her heir live up
Yeah.
to her glorious reign?
Well, this is all through the story. This begins
Yeah.
literally the second chapter and continues now through, through this whole book. So this is great to bring this up. This isn't necessarily a rabbit hole. This is one of the themes of this story that we'll be continually reminded of. And what brought this rabbit hole on is this is at this moment when Roger, the Baskerville, the youngest brother who died, was then inherited these evil characteristics of somebody. I mean, let me tell you something, people. You don't inherit evil, okay? That's but the Victorians were afraid that you did inherit evil, that the morality is part of this thing in your character
Mhm.
that could be passed on. And that's the
Yeah.
fear that goes all through this story. And it's a gothic fear too, right? Because this is the gothic, the sins of the past, come back to haunt you. That's a very gothic idea as well.
Yeah. But it's so interesting how that changes form from, the
Because now,
sins of the past coming back to haunt you in an 18th century Gothic novel would be, like I don't know, like the Castle of Otranto, where, you know, the main character has usurped his position and therefore his children are punished.
yeah,
Here the fear of the past coming back is literally like the evolutionary past, the
yeah,
past of humanity as a species from when we were like pre less evolved again. The Victorians projected this teleology onto evolution that arguably wasn't there in Darwin's original text. He just
yeah,
said,
yeah,
natural selection, like it's a random process. But then the Victorians were very uncomfortable with that idea. So they projected this teleology of like, no, we're actually evolving towards something like better and higher. But
yeah. Evolution doesn't
it
mean
doesn't say
progress,
that.
actually. It doesn't mean progress
Sorry?
at all. Evolution doesn't mean progress at all. It doesn't mean
It just
get
means
better.
change over time. I
Yeah,
mean, the title of Darwin, not to go on another tangent, but the whole title of Darwin's On the Origin of Species is on the origin of species, or the evolution of something by means of natural selection is
yeah,
the full title. So the title is about the process, about how do species originate and evolve through natural selection. That's what it's interested in.
yeah. And also, I think it's interesting the difference between the Gothic world, the Gothic viewpoint of that sins of the past, and this. It's not sins now. That now we're talking about science. Now we're talking about, kind of genetic characteristics being passed on. Although I don't think the Victorians were using those specific words, but they're trying to approach it scientifically, not spiritually, but or not well, not religiously, but they're mixing it all up anyway. And
Yeah, I mean, it's not, like a helmet falling from the sky as like a literal punishment by fate for your sins. But there is a certain kind of, it's a scientific framework, but the moral framework superimposed to it, where, if you're a criminal, you're less evolved, and also that's bad, obviously.
yeah. All right, let's jump back in. There's a dilemma here now. Um, if your supernatural theory be correct, it could work the young man evil in London as well in Devonshire, a devil with merely local powers, like a parish vestry, would be too inconceivable a thing. Holmes being
It's one of
funny
my
there.
favorite lines.
um, very funny line. But the dilemma is that the curse. I'm sorry, I skipped over because the dilemma for Mortimer is that the dilemma is the curse could kill the heir, Henry coming, but the community needs the heir. So this is what he's got to figure out. And Holmes, though, takes it lightly and gives him that very funny line that the devil with merely local powers. They uh
I mean, it's wonderful because, like, if it's supernatural, then it has to be truly supernatural. Like, in a supernatural story, you often can't escape fate. Like, it's not dependent on where you're located. Like, it's dependent on whether you've committed sins in the past or whether your family has committed sins in the past. So it's such a wonderful observation.
all righty. Gonna get a little more of this story, then I'm gonna hit a couple questions. Okay. Call off your spaniel who was scratching at my front door. He tells Dr. Mortimer. Doesn't come into the rooms. He doesn't bring his spaniel up with him. He's outside scratching at the front.
Oh, the
Literally
poor
leaves it out
puppy.
front. And then he says, we'll meet tomorrow at 10 o'clock with Sir Henry. I want you to bring Sir Henry here so we can talk about this. And Mortimer then scribbled the appointment on his shirt cuff. And here's a little annotation here. We've had this before in the stories about
Yeah,
home.
I was reading it and I thought of
Shirt
the
cuff.
last time I was on, we were discussing the shirt cuff thing.
Well, there you go. It comes back again. And for those who may have missed it, detachable cuffs is you had your cuffs on your shirts and your collars were actually detachable. This is something that developed over time because they get so dirty that then it develops that, oh, let's just make those detachable. So they're designed for this actually, in a sense, in that sometimes they're just disposable because they're so cheap, these cuffs. There's even I came across one paper collar advert. It's the collar and the cuffs were made of paper. And the advertisement said they will last and look very nice for several days and then can be thrown away without severe loss. So some of them could be paper. And then if that's true and they're disposable like that, you can easily write things on. But some are actually made of celluloid. And celluloid collars and cuffs could actually be cleaned with just a wet sponge. So I'm not sure because they're waterproof. I don't know how, like, the surface of a waterproof cuff might not actually be perfect for that. There was one advertisement said for that patent enameled paper collars. So they're paper, but then they're enameled. They're celluloid on them, are in great demand this season for tourists, both ladies and gentlemen. The material is a fine mixture of paper and cotton cloth, which will not wash, of course, but assumes the exact appearance of fine linen and Marseille beautifully got up. So, so they could, uh, you can write on your cuffs. It's not like writing on your shirt. Those things come off, and they're either disposable or washable. And Holmes did it in one of the other stories. I can't remember what exactly. I can't remember the exact story. One of the stories you were on with us.
Yeah, I think one of the last ones,
So
whatever my last one was, it was like on the
yeah.
22nd.
But Holmes has one last question. He says, one more question, Dr. Mortimer, which all I can think of is Columbo, right? What one more thing? And then he lays a question out there. Before Sir Charles Baskerville's death, several people saw the apparition upon the moor. And he says, three people did. Did any see it after? I have not heard of any. So there's
How
another clue.
convenient.
Yeah, how convenient. Now the creature disappears after he's dead. So, but it could still be,
After, yeah.
that's supernatural. It's only there to get Sir Charles. It's not there now that he's gone. Okay, but that's an important point that Holmes thinks that should be brought up. A couple questions here. Vanessa asks, now that the community helped me remember that it was Copper Beeches in the chat I saw here that featured the giant dog, the giant ferocious dog. Have Holmes scholars discussed the recycling of certain elements from that adventure story, or am I stretching it too much? When I read Copper Beeches, I thought it might have been a precursor to a certain degree. I think it
I
is
mean, Sherlock Holmes scholars, I think at this point have discussed so if you're
everything.
like, have Holmes scholars discussed this? The answer is probably yes.
Uh,
Um,
I
but
and
also,
Go
oh,
ahead.
I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
Uh, Jinx. Um, I mean, I do think in something like Copper Beaches, I feel like, we see a little bit of the precursor to that whole like murder in the British country house trope that becomes so familiar with Agatha Christie. And it's not sort of it's not unusual to think about that development because I mean, as Holmes says, I think maybe in that very story, the countryside is the perfect place to commit
Yeah.
crime because there's nobody around to notice what's happening inside a secluded house somewhere. So, it's not surprising that he would maybe recycle that idea in the sense of, yeah, it's not surprising that it comes up often in stories because the countryside and the British country house is in fact a great place to commit crime and get away with it.
Yeah. And there are several things in this longer story in this novel that have kind of echoes of things that he has done in earlier stories. And I'm sure you could find some of those things that and especially with dogs or things like that this kind of thing does come up in Doyle's stories. So I'm sure the things have been written about, but I don't know of any exactly.
Mhm.
Max has a question for you, Anastasia. Was that the source materials for the Alienist TV series? He says, I thought it was interesting, but not compelling. I'll look for the book. He wanted to know more.
I think because I think he's referring to maybe I put a quote in the chat about or a reference in the chat about
You're
Holmes's
even
scientific
chatting? Oh my
methods.
God. How can you chat and do this at the same time?
I don't know. Somehow it's the like it's a Slovenian liqueur. It's like it makes me like Holmes on cocaine or something. I actually haven't seen the Alienist TV show, Max, so I can't answer that for you. I'm so sorry, but I've been told I should watch it. But
I saw a
I'm
little bit of
also,
it, but never finished it. But I did read the Caleb Carr book on the Alienist, which was one of
I
my
mean, I'm just
novels.
very behind on my TV watching because for those of you who don't know, I was in Slovenia for like 6 weeks, and the thing with international rights is that you can't get the same TV shows in most of Europe that you can here, at least not on the same timeline. So there's a lot of things I'm very behind on.
Well, it's a few years old now, the Alienist TV series, but
Okay, well then I am
Caleb
very
Carr
behind.
novel is tremendously great that came out many years ago, a couple
Yeah,
decades.
yeah, I have it on my shelf right there, actually, right next to all the Sherlock Holmes books.
Here's a big question from Mayor. Given that the technological advances during Victoria's reign, do you have this in the Q&A? You can look at it too while I'm reading it. During Victoria's reign, the Industrial Revolution, same time, encouraged multiple generations to a sort of inevitability of scientific advancement and invention as proof of man's mastery of the universe and his apex position in it. Okay. Would you say that the supernatural elements of the story is a direct challenge to that view, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of? How is this view affected by Holmes's solving the mystery as he's done? Well, we can't get into Holmes solving the mystery, clearly.
Yeah, I was gonna say we can't talk about that.
But does this kind of, is this whole movement and this approach in the story a kind of answer? See, it goes even beyond that, doesn't it,
I
Anastasia?
mean, how much time do we have for me to go down another rabbit
really
hole?
we're talking about the Enlightenment, and when the Enlightenment started to figure out the kind of clockwork universe thing and how, you know, people.
I mean, so it's so funny you ask that, because so as us PhD people in the humanities, what we have to do is like usually turn our dissertation into a book. In my current book, the deadline for which is in 2 days. So, you know, I feel like an undergrad during exam week right now. But one of the things that book is about is precisely about this new 19th century worldview of humanity as masters of the universe because of all of these new scientific and technological developments, which really does sort of start happening in the 18th century, because in Britain, industrialization starts happening in the late 18th century. It's in France that it takes longer because, you know, Napoleon was busy doing other stuff.
Conquering
so yeah,
the world.
yes, and refusing to invest in modernization.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, there was a lot of you know, material change and development that really like transformed how people lived on a day-to-day basis, and kind of sped up change in a lot of ways so that people could see change in their lifetime in a way they hadn't seen previously. And I think this might resonate especially with people my age, where, you know, in like 10, 15 years, we've gone from like VHS to, you know, you can have everything in the cloud on something like this. Yeah, a lot of change was happening, and it really seemed like humanity could know everything and discover everything and dominate the natural world with science and technology. But at the same time, there are a lot of discoveries like, you know, Darwin's Origin of Species, which said, you know, we're not very significant at all. Like the reason we're here is literally just like random chance. That's what's responsible for natural selection. There was a lot of kind of anxiety by the 1890s, which is what we call the fin de siècle, so the end of the century. Like there are a lot of anxieties that, you know, progress has been happening, but we've like literally just run out of steam by the 1890s, and progress is an
No pun intended
inevitable.
with steam technology, but God.
Yeah, no pun intended. But yeah, this progress actually isn't just going to continue without end. That it has an end point. With evolution and atavism came all of these anxieties about yeah, atavism and reverting to less evolved forms of humanity. So this anxiety that instead of continuing to move forward, we could just sort of like slide back instead. What's stopping us from doing
Yeah.
that? So yeah, I teach the Hound of the Baskervilles really often in like Victorian Gothic courses or courses on the 1890s, because it really, like, not to be all like horror always reflects the anxieties of its moment in time, which like I feel like I'm broken record when I say that. But horror and genre fiction reflects the anxieties of its moment in time, and yeah, there seem to be all of these anxieties here about Holmes as a figure of like science and progress and rationality, but will he be defeated by this threat that's bigger than before, and that's supernatural and that's unsolvable? And like, is there a limit to knowability and progress and rationality and all of these Victorian values that we've held dear for decades, but also Queen Victoria is dead now?
Yeah. I want to get also an and in there, in that this whole mastery of the universe thing, but because of technology and development of science, it also has a different tone in the British Empire, in that they are out kind of mastering the world, and they really believe in that. And Doyle very much believes in empire, that they are going around and advancing the world because of their, power and abilities and technology that they have. So that's all kind of
Yeah.
wrapped up in that as well for this story. This is, in a sense, then I hadn't thought of it before, that then this also kind of becomes an empire story, if that's the way you want to, look at it.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm gonna once again take advantage of the fact that I am back with all of my books, which again for a literary scholar, like so happy. There's this wonderful book called The Triumph of Human Empire. Oh God, my camera is grainy. It's by Rosalind Williams. It came out like 10 years ago at this point, but um, yeah, it's about this. Well, first of all, it's about the very Western idea that the aim of science is to like conquer and dominate the natural world, which has not always been the aim of science. That's a very Western modern idea about
Yeah.
what science is. And the way
Understand the
that,
world or conquer the world? Which should we do? Let's conquer it.
yeah, I mean, that knowing how the universe works is one thing, but sort of bending that knowledge to our uses so that we can, I don't know, send text messages across the planet via these satellites that are hanging in geosynchronous orbit or whatever. I mean, like
Split the
that's an
atom, you know.
that's quite another. So it talks about how that was very much the ideology of the 19th century, how that gets reflected in works by Jules Verne, Robert Louis Stevenson, and others, but also how that's tied up with empire, because empire is so often about going to the uncharted places, mapping them and making them knowable so that you can extract value and resources from them, right? So that you can go there, you could dominate the people there, use them for labor so that you can take whatever is valuable there and bring that back to the core of the empire, um, which often requires, you know, mapping technologies, scientific advancements, communication technologies, advancements in science that empire is very much built on.
Good.
So that's
Yeah.
my other little tangent.
Yeah. It all comes into this story in some way or another.
See, there's a reason it's my favorite Holmes novel. I could talk for a very long time about how, like, if you want to distill like all of the anxieties of the Victorian period into a handful of novels, it would be like this one, Jekyll and Hyde, Oscar Wilde, and maybe like one other.
Mayor follows up on that. Would you say that the idea of empire was synonymous to the idea of advancement of civilization? And my answer would be absolutely yes.
I
So
mean, for
that
the
is the
Victorians and
goal.
the British at this
That
period,
is the
absolutely,
goal for the
yeah.
Victorians, the kind of the white man's burden, they called it. That we
I
now have,
mean, okay, not like 100%, not every single British. I mean, like obviously there were anti-imperial
yeah,
thinkers at
yeah,
every
there
moment,
certainly
but
were.
like that was very much the prevalent ideology.
Yeah. All righty. Holmes tells Watson, get out of here. I need I need you to leave now.
Poor Watson. I mean, if my own
Um,
roommate tried to kick me out, I would.
says it's the hour of action that I turn to you for aid. Right now, I need you to go away. And he says, when you do go away, when you pass Bradley's, would you ask him to send up a pound of the strongest shag tobacco, and then make it convenient not to return before evening? Then I should be very glad to compare impressions to this interesting problem. I can't.
Again, if Holmes was my roommate, I would sign up to be his roommate in the first place. So, maybe that's just me. But if he tried to do that to me, no, 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 night talk.
Well, Watson, and I'll get to the shag tobacco in a minute because I can't let a tobacco reference go without going down that rabbit
I
hole.
was expecting
But he
that.
says,
Yeah.
but first Watson says, well, no, we'll get to it then. Uh, Bradley's is apparently a tobacconist, and that'll come up again later in the story. So remember, Bradley's a tobacconist. Um, I wonder if Doyle has a particular tobacconist in mind. Like, I mean, you can look at the maps and you can like figure out. I wonder if there's one that he had in mind. We don't know. There are many tobacconists in London and near that area as well. But the shag tobacco is what he's smoking. And he also asks for a pound of it, which he's not going to smoke in one night. Like that's like a crazy amount of tobacco.
I mean, I don't know.
One
I don't smoke,
handy.
so I have no idea. I'll take your word for it.
Oh, a pound of tobacco is like a giant thing of tobacco. So it's like real, it's like the size of my head in a bag. It's like it's a lot of tobacco to smoke. Um, they uh but he's going to smoke and he needs to smoke a lot. This is what he needs right now. And we've seen this in Scandal in Bohemia, and we've seen this in Twisted Lip, where he smoked Twisted Lip. He smoked an ounce, a whole ounce, which is a lot of tobacco overnight, and it was shag tobacco. That's what was mentioned in both of those stories. Shag is a cut. But it's also a cheap not great tobacco. It's cut into fine ribbons. And here's a little bit, and I did this when we did Scandal Bohemia. This is from the Literary Gazette of 1839, but it's still true later in the century. Shag tobacco has obtained its distinctive name from its being so finely cut that the filaments appear like so much shag, the old name for short and matted wool or hair. It is manufactured of the strongest and very worst kind of leaf and is chiefly consumed by the poorer classes. Persons of a nervous temperament who take little exercise ought particularly to avoid smoking this kind of tobacco, as its frequent use is extremely apt to induce paralytic affections. Well, it won't, but
Smoking is bad for you.
it's a
Who knew?
really coarse, rough tobacco that is black shag, and that there was a company some time ago, McClellan, who used to, and I've shared this before too. They used to do it. They had a Sherlock Holmes line of tobaccos, and they actually did a black shag thing once. But of course, it couldn't be nasty cheap tobacco. They had to make it so it was actually good. So it was actually pretty tasty.
No, it would have been funny if like they sold some of the cheap worst
The
tobacco, but
worst
put all the
tobacco that
shag
they
on
had
there.
and said black shag. There it is. That's what Holmes would have smoked.
No, I mean that would have been funny. I also
I would
don't
have
smoke, so
smoked
this
it.
is
I
all
definitely
like
would have smoked
abstract
it.
to me.
I definitely would have smoked it just to know what it was like. Um, but Holmes might be a connoisseur of music. He might even be a connoisseur of wine. We have that mentioned a few times that he seems to know what wine is. But while he understands tobacco in all its forms, like he can even distinguish ash, he understands what all these tobaccos are. He doesn't care what he smokes.
I mean, it almost makes me think of like, you know, how like when you're an undergrad and you don't have much money, but you want to like pregame before going out. And mom, I promise I didn't do this in college, but like my friends did. Um, my mom is watching this. So like you want to pregame before you go out so that you don't have to pay for a bunch of expensive cocktails, but like you're cheap and you're a poor college student, so you buy the cheap booze to do a bunch of shots before you go. I feel like
Did you?
that's what
I don't
he's
know.
doing. Like he needs a stimulation, but he doesn't want to buy a pound of like
Do people do that?
expensive tobacco.
Well, it's smoking. It's because smoking for Sherlock is about sharpening his mind with nicotine, or
Mhm.
sometimes soothing it, because sometimes he needs that soothing thing, and that's also something that happens as well. But it's about what he gets from the nicotine. So he just like, so it doesn't matter. I just cheap tobacco with a lot of nicotine. I'll smoke a lot of it. That's fine. It doesn't matter. So he's not smoking because it tastes good, like me, of course. So, all righty. Watson doesn't return until night. And before that, he actually justifies the fact that he has to leave. And this is interesting because what it is it's this kind of reminder for the readers, I think, in 1901, because there haven't been Holmes stories for 8 years. And I'm sure in 1901, when the story came out, then now there's suddenly new Sherlock Holmes readers who are encountering Holmes for the first time. So we get this little thing: seclusion and solitude were very necessary for my friend in those hours of intense mental concentration, during which he weighed every particular of evidence, constructed alternative theories, balanced one against the other, and made up his mind to which points were essential and which immaterial. This kind of method of how Holmes thinks and figures out problems. I mean, if you're reading stories all along, you get this all the time. But I think there's also a little reminder here because because Sherlock has been off the page for a while, that we get that. Well, Watson comes in, and the room was so filled with smoke that the light of the lamp upon the table was blurred by it. It was the acrid fumes of strong, coarse tobacco, black shag, which took me by the throat and set me coughing. He has a vague vision of Holmes in his dressing gown, coiled up in an armchair with his black clay pipe between his lips. Several rolls of paper lay around him.
I mean, that's my like a literal worst nightmare. Like I already have neighbors who smoke, and even though they're not supposed to, it's like my worst nightmare. Like this is just like the actual literal stuff of nightmares for me.
I love a smoke-filled room. I've done this in my
We are not the
not
same, Ed. We are
realizing
not
it.
the same.
And I've had people come up, and Kate and the kids come and stand, and they're like, "Oh my God!" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I was smoking, and I had all the windows closed. I really love it. It's really nice." Um, but also he's smoking his black clay pipe, which has been mentioned in a couple of stories. And I got out one of my clays here, and it's not totally black, but you can see it's starting to blacken because this is what happens for these pipes: is that clay pipes is that kind of oils from the tobacco kind of creep in. And Holmes, though, is completely blackened now, as he has smoked it. This also is another sign that Holmes doesn't care about the taste of tobacco, because if it's completely blackened, it's going to be gross. You're gonna
Yeah, I mean,
it's
didn't
gonna
you
be
say in an earlier
harsh.
show that like you have to switch out your pipe, like you can't just keep smoking the
Yeah,
same one?
yeah,
Again, it's all I don't know. I don't understand how it all works, but
you do, and it's from that residue left over. But with a clay pipe, it's like it's all in there, and as it's heating up, all those old oils are still there. And um and actually, clay pipes can easily be cleaned. All Holmes has to do is put it in his fireplace, and the fire, the heating will actually, all the oils will come out of it, and after it gets heated up, the clay, you pull it out after it cools, and it'll actually be white again. Um, but Holmes doesn't care about that. He wants it
he's too
seasoned.
busy thinking about important problems. I love that we're getting the demonstrations here.
There you go. Well,
It's
it's
gonna be okay.
also earlier in one of the earlier stories, he's called it his disputatious clay. What he is what he likes. And In that, because it's disputatious, or that's the mood that he's in. It's not that that this particular pipe is causing him to be disputatious. It's that he is trying to figure something out, some dispute, and this pipe is helping him solve that. So,
Mhm.
well, caught cold, Watson? No, it's the poisonous atmosphere. So he lets him open up a window. That's
I
nice.
mean, I just love that it's too much for Watson, who is also a smoker. Like that's when you know it's bad.
Um, Mayor asks, much as his 7% solution was a tool to combat boredom, would shag also be a tool for stimulation? It is, and that's what nicotine does. It kind of sharpens you a little bit, and this is what it does. There are different times. So sometimes it acts and it helps sharpen his thinking and get very meditative and do that. And sometimes it's solace, and sometimes it's actually a way of calming down everything that is going on. So it can act as both. Holmes does the whole Dr. Bell trick with Watson here again, that he does all the time. And he's like, oh, you've been at the club all day. And how do you think I know that? And has to go through this whole thing. What I find interesting, Anastasia, is that this happens in the first episode, in the first serial part with the stick, and where he has to, like, what can you deduce from this? And now he's doing the same thing about, like, here's my observations and here's how I deduce them. So he's got to reinforce that again. And it's fun. So and Watson has been at the club, and there's obviously reasons that he can figure that out. But where has Holmes been?
In Devonshire.
He's been in Devonshire. How? But you've been here the whole time. It's like he is astral projected to Dartmoor.
I mean, there's a story in which Holmes says, like, I'm mere brain, the rest of me is mere appendix, and the brain, the mind, the stuff that's right here can travel anywhere. It's the body that's the annoying extra you can get rid of sometimes. The body constantly needs to be filled with tobacco.
Yes. And speaking of tobacco, Mare had another question. She was, I didn't understand why the thing would blacken. She's like, wouldn't the black residue if the heat removes it, why doesn't smoking it remove it? It doesn't get hot enough. You've got to heat it to the point where it's like you're baking the clay again, and then the oils leave. So smoking it won't get that hot. I can still touch it. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes it gets a little too hot to touch, but it's not so hot that it's glowing, and that's when the oils come out. But I love this idea of astral, because what Holmes says is that he's kind of astral projected. Now, he said it and he didn't, because and there's been, somebody asked me this recently about Holmes and that an astral projection. Doyle didn't believe in astral projection, it seemed. This kind of idea that you could take your spirit out and your spirit could move across the world. But only because he didn't think it could be proven. And there were all these other spiritualists who believed in it, but they were these kind of occult magic spiritualists, and he wasn't a real big fan of them. So in a sense, and this goes back to the question that Adam had asked earlier about Doyle responding to spiritualist things. I wonder if this passage almost reads kind of like a little joke at the expense of people who believed in that your spirit could move and to travel around the world without your body, in that Holmes is now saying, well, of course my spirit can go somewhere. I just concentrate and my mind goes there. I just need coffee, tobacco, and a map, and I'm there. Which is how I travel, actually. While you're heading off all around the world, Anastasia, it's not coffee usually, it's alcohol, tobacco, and maps. That's how I travel.
Yeah, well, for me, I use airline miles. Those help a lot, but I don't think they had those in Holmes's day.
I travel in books. And Holmes is traveling by map. He has pulled out he has gotten a map of the area that they're talking about in Dartmoor, and he has gone through it and imagined and seen all the places that they're talking about, that Mortimer talked about, and putting them all together here. And I wish there should have been a map in this original publication. I don't know why Doyle didn't put together a little map of the area with Baskerville Hall and the other places. Um, you can, I love maps and stories. You can find lots of Hound maps online. I have one in this collection. It's this case files of Sherlock Holmes, and it's one of these things where they have all these documents inside. Um, it's a little spurious because they actually have the curse of Baskerville Hall, and they have it dated 1792, which is ridiculous because in the story it literally says 1742, and so it's like they have a typo on one of their,
I don't know. Maybe that 9 could be a 4.
But they have a map in there, but it's like a homemade map that like Holmes or Watson would have drawn themselves. And while that's fun, that's not what Holmes is looking at. He's looking at an ordnance map. But the famed Sherlockian Julian Wolfe, Anastasia, I don't know if you know this. Julian Wolfe was commissionaire of the Baker Street Irregulars,
Yeah.
editor of the Baker Street Journal in the 1960s. He created an atlas of Sherlock Holmes, what was called the Sherlockian Atlas, and it was done in a very limited publication, like I don't know, 100 copies or something like that. It was later reprinted in I think the early 80s or something like that by somebody. But Wolfe did a map of Dartmoor that's interesting to look at, and you can find this online, which is where I got it. Somebody posted it online, and here it is. He's got the moor here. He's got it, and it's decorative. He's got this large magnifying glass here showing the house itself, giving us like, even more in-depth detail about it. But here's the Grimpen Mire up here. Here's Coombe Tracy down here and the road that goes to it, Laughter Hall, Foulmire, the prehistoric huts. There you can find several online maps for this, and they all kind of differ in, a little bit. Where they place everything. But it's fun to look at a map, and we'll see. Holmes is looking at a map now. This is fun to have for later in the story when we go there. So for you to follow along with the action. That's what I love to do with maps. Wolfe's Sherlockian Atlas had 13 black and white maps. There was a map for London, England, Europe, the island of Uffa, the world, the Surrey side. There's a map called It Is Full of Old Houses. I don't know what that is. I'd like to say it. His last bow window was what the map is called. There's a map of the United States, Dartmoor that we just saw, Operation Reichenbach, and Sherlock Holmes in Japan. And there's a map for the Apocrypha. I haven't seen all these maps, so I'm fascinated by some of the names for them. But each map contains markings for all the places mentioned in the stories. So they're hard to acquire, this Sherlockian Atlas. But for collectors, maybe you could find a copy. Holmes says, well, he goes through, he tells Watson all these places. Here's Baskerville Hall, here's Grimpen, here's Laughter Hall, Foulmire. This is the stage upon which tragedy has been played and upon which we may help to play it again. And then he says, if the devil did desire to have a hand in the affairs of men, and Watson says, then it's supernatural. And then again, he's like, the devil's agents may be flesh and blood, may they not? So Holmes is then doing this thing, right? This is the rational and the supernatural, and he's trying to figure out which it is. And he says there's 2 questions at the outset, but then he gives him 3 questions. Whether any crime has been committed at all, and and what is the crime and how was it committed? So that's why it's 3. And he is, if Mortimer's correct and it's supernatural, well, then there's nothing we can do about it, but we have to exhaust all the hypotheses before falling back on this one. And this is the kind of, way that Doyle is also approaching, as I mentioned, the spiritual world. He did believe in the scientific method and fact. I mean, he's just wrong sometimes in assessing what those facts were, but that this is the process that he thinks they need to go through, and Doyle is also going, or Holmes is also going through this method as well. There's more, and then he talks more about the case, which leads to more questions. That he was on tiptoe. The evidence showed for some of the footmarks. Well, that means he's running. So why is he running? Well, because he's afraid. He's afraid of what? He must be afraid from something from the moor. What was he afraid of? Whom was he waiting for? These then leads to more questions. So while he starts with there's two big questions we have to answer, which are really three, asking those questions, looking at the evidence then leads to more questions. And this is the way Holmes deduces and solves crimes. We see the method at work here, looking at the evidence, asking questions about it, and then coming up with answers, which are imagination, which are, this could be it, but that's the hypothesis. Then you need to go and test. So, all righty. Well, the chapter ends with, hand me my violin. And now a little music and relaxation before the next day when they're going to meet with Sir Henry and Dr. Mortimer.
Oh, I always love when he plays the violin, and just he and Watson have a relaxing evening.
Apparently. Well, it's funny that in most adaptations, Watson's always like, oh, you're playing the violin again. But in the stories, I don't think it ever comes up that Watson is annoyed with him playing,
And there is one time when Holmes is making like just a complete ruckus on his violin. He's not like even playing any melodies. He's just, discordant sounds. And Watson gets really annoyed. So to soothe him, Holmes plays like a sonata that he likes. But I can't recall which story that was. But I always found that such like a charming moment. It's like you spent the entire day annoying your roommate, but then you're like, okay, here, have this song you like to make you feel better.
All right, let's get through chapter 4. Holmes waited in his dressing gown for the promised interview. I like that Holmes is in his dressing gown. This seems to be like he's okay
Always.
with clients in his dressing gown. Like, not very professional, is it? But it's fine.
I mean, by this point, Holmes is so rich and famous that like he can do whatever he wants, It's like what's her name in The Devil Wears Prada, where she's so important that she could just do whatever she wants and demand whatever she wants of her interns, and nobody can say a word.
There you go. That's good. Devil Wears Prada reference for a Sherlock
I
story.
bet you guys didn't think you'd get that one in a Sherlock Holmes
I
episode.
like that. Sir Henry comes. He's described here, and he's sturdy, strong, pugnacious, and yet he retains the gentleman. It says something in his steady eye and the quiet assurance of his bearing which indicated the gentleman. Again, like we another reminder of this kind of inherited ancestral traits. This time it's the good side, like the kind of that he's the gentleman.
Oh yeah, definitely inheritance, but don't worry, this guy is the good guy. We can tell just by looking at him because, skull science and physiognomy told us so.
Yeah. Well, there's also that kind of that you can't, the nobility in somebody you can't do away with. It's that like Tarzan thing, right? He's because he's a lord by birth, he's also going to be able to master, the jungle, even though he's raised by apes. This kind of the true prince or princess will always be revealed because
Which
of,
again, that's such a gothic thing going
yeah,
back to the Castle of Otranto, the very first gothic novel, where,
yeah,
the true heir is like living as a peasant boy, but he has such a nobility of bearing, like that's just above what you expect from a peasant boy. And surprise, he's not a peasant boy, he's a real and true heir,
yeah.
the legitimate heir. who can restore peace and order.
Well, Henry shows up with a puzzle. He says he's got a puzzle for him because he's gotten this letter, this note letter that he's received at the hotel. And no one knew he was staying there. That's the first question Sherlock asks. And it is on foolscap paper. For those who don't know, foolscap is a kind of it's the size of the paper, but it's also a kind of cheap paper you can get at any stationery store. And it's named, and it's that kind of legal paper length, approximately. It's like it's a little bigger than 8 by 11. But it is named foolscap because of the original watermark on this size paper from the 17th century, which had a jester and a cap in a cap on it. That was the watermark on this paper. And then this size paper just becomes, commonly referred to as foolscap. The note reads, "As you value your life or your reason, keep away from the moor." But all of the words except for more are cut out from something else and pasted on, like one of the ransom notes that you see now. Adam had a question for us. Is this the first instance of using cutout words from a newspaper or magazine to write a letter in literature? It's become a common movie trope, especially for kidnapping letters. Are there earlier instances of it? I have no idea.
I don't know.
I mean, the fact that it's in this story, which was so famous and which so many people read, this may be the story then that continues that makes it a trope, even though Doyle might not have invented it. So I don't know. But that is something I'm definitely going to investigate now and find out. I want to know what that is. That's somebody cutting out letters and making that, thing. So, Holmes's first reaction is, well, there's nothing supernatural here. Somebody's literally giving you a paper warning from cut out words. This is not supernatural.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the devil wanted to warn you, he could do better.
Yeah, it's not gonna inspire you to cut out words. So or one of his demon agents isn't gonna cut out words the paper's gonna burn.
I mean, and something like Good Omens by Neil Gaiman, he might, but we're not quite at that point yet. Would it be a little too blasphemous? So
Holmes then asks for paper. Do you have the Times from yesterday, Watson? And then he recites this paragraph from Capital Article this on free trade. And it turns out that that's where all the words were cut from. And then Holmes says this horribly racist thing here. "I presume, Doctor," to Mortimer, "that you could tell the skull of a Negro from that of an Eskimo." Now, I say it's racist, but in the Victorian age, it was racist, but they didn't realize that, because they really did believe that you could derive clues about races from skulls. Now, you can derive kind of geographical ethnicity in some sense from skulls. Like there'll be some things that'll match up, but you can't, it's not specifically race. And there's a wealth of 19th century science about skull measurements and race, and and what usually happens is they were using it to prove that other races aren't as developed or as smart as white people.
yeah, I mean, speaking of empire, you'd have a lot of, say, like British scientists going to one of the British colonies, which there were many, like literally physically like forcing the native people to like allow their skulls to be measured, and then writing those numbers down, and then coming back to Britain and going like, look at these numbers, clearly that proves X, Y, and Z.
I always wonder, it's a thing that, like, just as people used science to prove this kind of thing, like looking at skulls and saying you could tell different races and how some are smart, and like they literally believed that they had proof of this, and people believed it. I
Mhm.
wonder, Anastasia, what scientific things we look at that we feel really prove things now that in 100 years, 200 years, they will look at and say, like, can you believe they misinterpreted this as this? So
I
it's
mean, I mean, I think we obviously can't say because we're in the moment, but
yeah.
I have noticed a lot of people, for example, saying, well, they were wrong about skull signs in the 19th century, so maybe we're wrong about like climate change today, and therefore we shouldn't do anything to like fix climate change, which I feel like is a really disingenuous, like I've heard this a lot from people,
I haven't
and I
heard that.
find that
That's
like a
funny.
really disingenuous way to talk about the way that like,
Yes.
yeah, science develops
That's
and maybe
not the question I meant to raise.
yeah, yeah, I'm sorry.
I didn't mean
um,
using this thing from the past as a way to, smash things now that we can actually prove. But there will be things in the future that we were wrong about because of the way we interpreted them, and the bias that we brought to that action into the method of looking at things. So,
mhm,
all right, and,
yeah.
and it ain't going to be on climate science, let me tell you. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
um,
I mean, it's just like it's a very ugly his part of the history of science that people often like use to delegitimize science as a practice. Which I could go down a huge rabbit hole there, but that's not the topic of this, you know, series, so I won't. But it's always felt to me, very disingenuous.
yeah. Well, oh boy, there's even a scientist in the chat here, so I'm gonna ask him sometime soon. All righty.
I mean, statistically, we were gonna get like at least one scientist in this mix, given the
Oh, we're
number
gonna
of
have
like,
several, so I'm sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna ask him. So I'm talking about you, Matt. So I see you in the chat there. I'm gonna ask you about these questions. All righty. Well, Holmes points out that just as Mortimer can do his science, he can actually tell the differences in typeface. And then he says the nerdiest thing Sherlock has ever said. I confess that once when I was very young, I confused the Leeds Mercury with the Western Morning News. I love that. That is the nerdiest thing Sherlock has ever said. And I love it. No,
That's so, that's like to me, that's like saying, back when I was like 15 and learned French, I like conjugated this verb wrong in the pluperfect or something. Like, it's so funny.
it is, and it's such a nerdy thing to, and he's like, he's almost like bragging about, like, oh, I once did this, and like he's bragging about the mistake that he made, which shows how much he knows, and I absolutely love it. So, that's not a commentary. That's just hilarious. Um, he has further deductions about this. Well, he goes this back and forth with Baskerville, like someone cut it out with scissors, nail scissors, pasted it with paste. It was actually gum, and he goes through this stuff, and Holmes has these deductions that it was an educated person who was trying to look uneducated, and they also concealed their handwriting, and they were in a hurry. Um, and Mortimer thinks, like, this is guesswork. And Holmes says again, this is the region where we balance probabilities and choose the most likely. It's the scientific use of the imagination, but we have always some material basis on which to start our speculations. So,
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people have pointed out that Holmes's deductions are essentially probability. There's actually a very good
yeah.
show called, well, actually, I don't know if I'd call it good, but there's a very interesting show called The Mentalist, which is like, what if Sherlock Holmes was basically like a con man pretending to be a psychic? That's like the premise, and of course, he's doing the same thing of like
Is it?
observing
That
and
sounds more
making.
like psych.
Well, no, psych is where he pretend like he pretends.
He's pretending.
Okay. I mean, no, but Yeah, they're similar. The
Okay.
psych is kind of comic, but the mentalist has like
I
this
know
tragic
Psych better than I know
backstory.
Mentalist. So that's what.
Um, it's like the most formulaic, um, crime show I've ever seen in my life. But to be fair, I don't watch a lot of crime shows unless they're based on Sherlock Holmes. But he does something psychics call cold reading, which is like making observations and then essentially, like making guesses based on probability. Like,
Yeah.
there's obviously there could be another explanation, but there's a very high probability that this is the explanation. That's like how modern day psychics work. And
Yeah.
um
That's how you do cold
that's
readings. Yeah. Read
yeah.
the room,
So
make
it's
notes.
a nice acknowledgement that, it really is based on probability, which
Yeah.
a lot of people, especially in the modern day, a lot of people like to criticize Holmes's method and be like, well, no, he's just like guessing and picking the most likely scenario. And it's like, well, yeah, he is. It's just that, because this is a work of fiction, he tends to be right most of the time because, otherwise we wouldn't want to read the story.
Yeah. Madeline in the chat, confirmed you that it was the mentalist is a con man. So who does these things. So there you go.
I
Uh,
mean, yeah, but trust me, I watched all 5 seasons or 7 seasons of it because I was asked to write essay on Sherlock Holmes in American television. And so yeah, I went down a rabbit hole and watched seven
wow.
seasons
That's a lot of
of
TV to watch.
it was like Christmas vacation.
Is it only
Um,
modern TV or could you do like Columbo and things like that? I mean,
I mean, I had a like what 3,000 word limit, so it was more that than anything. Um, but
like I
yes, I went
mentioned,
I went down that rabbit hole, and it was actually very interesting in the way that like um Sherlock Holmes gets a lot of like, you could be a wizard, you could be a magician, but then he explains the trick, right? He's like, no,
yeah,
this is how I deduce that. But
there's a lot of
the thing with
explaining.
a professional psychic is, they do the same thing, but they don't explain the trick.
They're
They
not
let
going to
people keep
explain it.
thinking that
Yeah.
they're like the magician or the
Yeah.
like they can read your mind or whatever. But it gets the same
Yeah.
methodology. Like Holmes just explains the trick.
Holmes says, this is how I did it. It's not magic. It's observation. So
Yeah. Still makes money on it though.
he he does. He realizes that the note was written in a hotel because of the way the pen and the ink and then he stops and he says, "Hello, hello, what's this?" He was carefully examining the foolscap upon which the words were pasted, holding it at only an inch or two from his eyes. "Well, nothing," said he, throwing it down. "It's a blank half sheet of paper without a watermark kind of thing." He doesn't say what he notices there. I'm going to share um the Patchett illustration from that. Here it is. It's, he's holding it an inch or two from his eyes. He's staring at the paper and he makes a big deal, but like, "Oh, what's this?" And then he says, "It's nothing. Don't worry about it." And he doesn't explain why he has suddenly stopped and looked at the paper this way. Um, we just get a nothing when he's asked, but he's obviously seen something. So we'll find that out later or why he did that. Okay. Um, he asks if he asked Sir Henry if he's being watched or followed, of course, because somebody has to know where he's where he's staying to send the note. So and but Henry doesn't know. He's been in Canada all his time in states in Canada, and then he says, "But I lost one of my boots." And I wasn't going to tell you because this isn't a big deal, but it's just weird that it happened. And of course, Holmes loves this, right? Because there is nothing,
Anything weird is interesting and
yeah, there's
remarkable.
nothing so important as trifles, especially when they're unusual. Um,
Mhm.
and, um, what is the use of troubling Mr. Holmes with trifles of this kind? He actually says, or Dr. Mortimer says, and Holmes is like, oh no, this is a weird one. So, and apparently, but they're brand new. He just bought them, so why would somebody take one new boot? Um, Holmes finds out that they were around town, they were shopping, so they were walking around town. Um, and what's interesting is now Sir Henry says, I've heard of the Hound. Well, this is actually the point where they finally share the curse of the Baskerville document and everything. Sir Henry hasn't even heard about any of this stuff. That this is finally now where he learns why the curse of the family has everyone concerned.
I
Um,
mean, at least he's heard of it before as like a childhood story.
Yeah. So they read it to him, or Dr. Mortimer reads it, but now he says, I've heard of it. I knew it. It was a story in the family, but I never took it seriously. But it's interesting. It's not until this point that Henry doesn't have any context of why they're actually concerned, why he's actually seeing Sherlock Holmes is until now. And Holmes and his response is, well, then I don't know if we need a policeman or a clergyman to solve this, to figure out what's going on here. Um, Holmes says about the note that it's either somebody who's trying to help you by warning you or threatening you, which is interesting because it's not necessarily worded as a threat. It's stay away from the moors. Maybe somebody's trying to help you. So this is one of the things that has to be figured out here. And then is he going to stay or go? Is he going to go to the hall? And Henry says, there's no devil in hell, Mr. Holmes, and there's no man upon earth who can prevent me from going to the home of my own people, and you may take that to be my final answer.
See, because it's his inheritance and
Yeah.
he's a good heir, so he will return to the home of his forefathers to take care of his people and be their steward, which makes him, the good heir as opposed to the bad heir.
Although Watson does note that it was evident that the fiery temper of the Baskervilles was not extinct in their last representative. Maybe he's got the Sir Hugo in him, but we find out immediately after that he doesn't, because then he says, I should like to have a quiet hour to myself to make up my mind. So you may take that to be my final answer, but give me an hour and I'm gonna think about it, is what that he winds up saying. So he is he's not like Sir Hugo. He's not, that isn't the trait that he has inherited, but he has inherited, as you said, the kind of nobility of the Baskervilles.
Mhm.
Well, he leaves and Holmes right away, and they leave and they descend, and Holmes is right away. Your hat and boots, Watson, quick. I got to put his boots on too. Was Watson not wearing shoes? What was he
I mean,
wearing?
I don't know. I find it weird to wear shoes inside the house, but like I realize that's a really very big cultural
Oh,
difference all around the world.
I get out of the shower, I put my shoes and socks on. They don't leave until I'm going to bed. I'm not a barefoot socks kind of person, but like he's got footwear on. I don't understand why he would need, like, does he mean put your boots on instead of the, like, what is Watson wearing anyway? Well, no, that's not true. No, it's morning. Holmes is in his dressing gown. So yeah, it is true. Watson probably could be wearing, Max says in the thing, slippers, and somebody else said slippers. Yeah, so he is probably house slippers. He is probably still just wearing slippers because he's, um, it's the morning when they met him. There you go. That's why he says, put your boots on quick. Well, they dash out and follow Mortimer and Baskerville as they're walking back to their hotel. And Holmes just tells Watson, I'm perfectly satisfied with your company if you were to tolerate mine. Our friends are wise, for it is certainly a very fine morning for a walk. Holmes doesn't even tell Watson what they're doing.
Yeah, he never tells Watson anything, the poor guy.
but he gives a little cry of satisfaction, and following the direction of his eager eyes, I saw that a hansom cab with a man inside was halted opposite them. And Holmes says, "There's our man, Watson. Come along. We'll have a good look at him if we can do no more." Watson sees, like Holmes, someone inside with a bushy black beard and a pair of piercing eyes. And then as they've noticed it, he yells to the cabman to go, and they fly off down Regent Street. So Holmes says, "Was ever such bad luck and such bad management too, Watson? If you were an honest man, you will record this also and set it against my successes. Holmes just made a mistake and knows it, and wants Watson to note it down in the case." So we have it, of course, because this is the Watson recording the case, and Holmes got his wish that it was a mistake. And if only we could have gotten the Watson. Holmes tells Watson, I thought somebody must have been following him. I was looking out the window while they were at Baker Street. We're dealing with a very clever man, Watson. This matter cuts very deep, and though I have not finally made up my mind whether it is a benevolent or a malevolent agency which is in touch with us, I am conscious always of power and design. So frequently, as we've seen in cases, Anastasia, Holmes solves it pretty much after somebody lays the case down. And now it's just a matter of going out and figuring out the details and making sure that he solved it. He doesn't know yet. He hasn't figured it out yet, but what he can tell is that there's somebody behind this. And
somebody who seems to be a worthy opponent.
With a beard, which is good for me. Watson's like, "Oh,
I don't know if you were the bad guy in this story and you needed to shadow the guy, would you shave off your beard, Ed, so that you wouldn't be recognized?"
I'm not shaving off. That's why I can't be a super spy, because I'm not going to get rid
I mean, that's Holmes's argument, right? Like, the beard has to be fake, and if he had a real one, he would have shaved it off so that he wouldn't be recognized. And like, yeah. I don't know. I've known a lot of men with beards, and some of them would be like, "I don't care if I go to jail, but you're not taking my beard."
Yep, that is that is it. So, I'll take beard parts from now on, but I won't shave it to do any other kind.
Well, so Max says in the chat, Ed's superpower is that his beard grows back almost overnight.
Well, it does not.
Would you like to confirm or deny?
It would take a very long time to grow it back. So, Holmes gets the number of the cab. It's 2704, so they can trace the cab. And then Holmes says why it was a big mistake. I should have just not noticed it and walked along and followed it so they could grab him. And then he says, I could swear only by the beard. I could swear only to the beard, Watson says, and Holmes figures it's probably false. And then they go to the district messenger office. And I got info from the Leslie Klinger annotated that the district messenger service company was the actual name of one of these, and they competed with the post office to send messages to people. You could go to them.
Oh, so they were like FedEx.
Yeah, that's exactly what they were. And you would pay by the mile, or you would pay by the hour. There were different rates you would pay, and you could go there and you could say, I need you to send this message to this person, and there you go. So
the district messenger, that's also the name of the newsletter of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, which is a quaint little thing.
And then he goes there and he says, he mentions a little case, which I had the good fortune to help you, Wilson, who's in the office. So we don't get it's an unpublished case, so I have to mention it, but we don't get any details about it. He helped Wilson of the district messenger office with a case, and he asked for Cartwright, the messenger boy, who helped as well, a lad named Cartwright who showed some ability during the investigation. And then he hires Cartwright to go around to all the hotels 23 hotels. He grabs a hotel directory and finds out all the hotels. And he says, go around all these and ask to see the waste paper trash from all the rooms, and see if he can find an edition of the Times that, in this page where the words are cut out. So, and he gives them shillings, for lots of shillings to pay off people, and some shillings for himself too. And then he tells Watson, we're gonna wire. He's gonna wire about the cab, and now Watson, you read that last sentence there?
And now Watson, it only remains for us to find out by wire the identity of the cabman, number 2704, and then we will drop into one of the Bond Street picture galleries and fill in the time until we are due at the hotel.
Let's go to a picture gallery. Let's go look at some nice paintings.
I mean, let's go look at art. I'm a scientific man, but I'm going to pass my time by looking at art.
Well, it's the big difference here between when we started with studying Scarlet, where Watson's like, Holmes doesn't know about anything, to like very soon, and it's really in the sign of it's really in the next story, we find out Holmes is a polymath and knows about everything.
I mean, it was more common to be a polymath in the 19th century, like partly because if you were like an educated aristocrat or middle class person, like you would have had a very wide ranging education, but also because like science professionalizing, the emergence of different scientific disciplines, that was all happening, at this moment in time. So it was much easier to be a polymath because there weren't such strong divides between different disciplines, and it was much more normal to like dabble into multiple things, especially if you're middle or upper class.
And someone pointed out in the chat too, his whole interaction with Cartwright here is this kind of, Holmes's has this excellent reports from Adam, an excellent rapport with working class people, so that he's uses them and talks to them and can work well with someone like Cartwright, or somebody like is it Wilson, Wilson from the district messenger service there. So that's all I got. And then it's to be continued. To be continued. There was one other question in here from Max. This is one of the more famous, generally, even if the most famous Holmes stories. Why haven't more manuscript pages been discovered in estate sales and attics and tin boxes at Cox's?
Well, Max, I know that you know the answer to this question, so I know that you asked this like to get us to talk about it. Very clever.
This, though, is actually something we're going to talk about in the legacy of the Hound in the very last episode, in which Max McGee will be the co-host. And one of the things we're going to talk about is the remaining manuscript for this story. So there you go.
So Max is planting the clues for
you'll get
I love that.
Matt says it ends on a cliffhanger. It does. We're just looking at pictures in a gallery at the Bond Street Gallery.
I mean, this was serialized, so you had to deal with the cliffhanger until
not nearly as much of an ending as the first part, where these are the footprints of a gigantic hound. Now it's just, let's go look at some paintings. That's what we get. So, all righty. Well, I want to thank you, Anastasia, for doing this episode with me. This is always wonderful to have you on board for anything I do, really. Thank you so much. Thanks to our chat, Mrs. Hudson, Brianna, for managing the links in the chat. Thanks, Brianna. Sherlockians, thank you for joining us for the second episode of Sherlock Mondays, The Hound of the Baskervilles. By registering for this program, you have helped the Rosenbach create more programs like our free Biblioventure series, and also help us care for our collections, including several Doyle first editions and the manuscript for The Empty House. If you would like to make a further donation or become a member, you can do so at our website, rosenbach.org. Your generosity will be greatly appreciated. I will see you all next week, or you will all see me next week, for episode 3 of The Hound, chapters 5 and 6, with co-host Monica Schmidt. Monica's coming back, Anastasia. That'll be fun.
Fantastic.
All right, everyone. Bye-bye. Anastasia, bye-bye. I forgot to actually play the theme last week for the close, so I'm not going to forget to do that this week.
Okay.
um,
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a wonderful discussion.
Always a pleasure having you. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library, where the game is a book. And I need to share the picture, which I don't have right now. There it is, where the game is a book. Bye-bye, everyone.